Hey, good morning. You're joining. We're going to cover accounts receivable today, but more specifically, receiving payments. And so, not creating invoices or any of that stuff, but recently there's been changes in Intacct with how we can receive payments, and they've announced that one of the primary methods we've been using is going to be discontinued and not supported. There hasn't been a discontinued date, but any improvements or enhancements Intacct is making will now only be for the new method for receiving a payment. So we have an opportunity now to be working on that simultaneously while, if we run into trouble, we can still revert back to our old way for a short period of time. So first thing we're going to look at is just receiving a payment in the original method. So if we're working accounts receivable outside of finance, the typical user would go to accounts receivable, receive a payment, and from here they can choose the payment method, which for almost every instance we do, if it's not finance, the method is check. They use an undeposited funds account and can choose their customer to start working on invoices. So I have an existing customer invoice already created as a drawdown, so we can see draw 9213 I created today for $1 is due. So this is the typical screen a user would see, and they'd be able to apply payment from here by entering the date that it's going to hit the general ledger, the date the check is actually dated for, its amount, and the check number. And one aspect or improvement they're making here is with this check amount. Under this method, if the check exceeded the bill, we'd actually have to stop what we're doing and then take additional steps to receive the payment first before we can come back here and apply the payment. And that's called an overpayment. And so we'll look at that later. But that's one of the things they're correcting, is our ability to take in payments greater than the invoice. And then the check number or money order, depending on the type of funds they receive. And so this was our original method. If we're working in finance, our accounts receivable staff may actually go to the drawdown itself, find one that is not paid, and then choose to pay it from here. And so they get a more simplified screen. So if it's a check or a record transfer, that kind of stuff, they can choose the type of payment method, its amount, a reference number if there's a bank reference number. They leave it at the bank and then choose the bank account the funds will be deposited to. The general ledger receipt date, and then the payment date. And this method through order entry isn't changing, but one of the weaknesses this one has is if there's credit memos or there's credits out there for the customer, that typically isn't seen here, so we don't know that needs to be applied. So we want to look at the new methods and probably the preferred method for applying payments in any accounts receivable situation. And the first method is by actually going to accounts receivable and invoices itself rather than order entry. And if we search by the customer that I created an invoice for, we have this open invoice for $1. And we want to apply the payment through here rather than through order entry, which we get a different dialog screen than we've ever seen before. We have to choose the bank, or if we're outside of finance, we choose undeposited funds. We choose the bank account. So I created this under account 35 that we no longer use. Still can choose the payment method, but now we determine how much has been received. So if we've done a drawdown and I have a $1 drawdown out there, hopefully that matches. We haven't made any entering errors, or for solid waste or childcare, customer may pay a different amount than what we're actually receiving. So we can enter that amount received here. What date do we want this activity to occur on the general ledger? And what is the payment or transaction date that's on the form of payment we're receiving? So if it's a money order, a check, an electronic funds transfer, that kind of stuff, we would flag that there. But this date doesn't really have an effect on our general ledger other than just it's recording when that item was dated. Its number, a memo if there's notes we need to make, and now they've added the ability to add attachments. So if we wanted to add attachments of a copy of our money order, our drawdown records, that kind of stuff, the bank confirmation for receipt of funds, we can actually do that through Intacct. Before, we couldn't add any sort of supporting records to say why that payment's being applied to this invoice. And nice thing about Intacct, it's purchasing or accounts receivable, anywhere you go, we can add attachments by clicking add, or you can find the attachment on your computer and just drag and drop it, and it adds it for you. And that's for multiple attachments. So we don't have to constantly go through viewing the attachment, editing it, and then finding it on our desktop. We can cut a lot of these steps out by just dragging and dropping. And once we've entered this information up here, we have our check number, we have our information. This method automatically applies the full amount to the first line, regardless of the amount the check says. So if the check was for 50 cents, it still has $1 that it wants to apply. So if we're receiving less than that amount, we can just change that to what it says. And then our 50-cent payment would go against that, and we'd have a partially paid bill that we'd expect a payment down the road. Or if we're receiving more than the invoice, as happens on occasion, we might be applying the dollar here. We have an amount received of $2, and at the bottom they have overpayment dimensions. So now we can start to add, where do we want that overpayment to apply? So I would use the same dimensions I used on the invoice, are my test company, my test funding source. So if we're applying any overpayments, whether we're childcare, adult corrections, anybody, we should be using the same dimensions on the invoice. Because what this will do is create a credit in an overpayment account that later on, when a new invoice is created, we can apply the payment to it. Or an extra way of keeping track of that, so that now we know we need to refund the money to whoever paid us. And so that we can see by going right through to invoices, finding the partially paid or open invoice, and going through apply payment. What we also have is an area that says receive payments new. And so if we click there, just like anywhere else in Intacct, we'll see a list of all the payments that have been received so far. So based on whatever we have access to, we would see a list of those payments. If we want to add a new payment that we're collecting, we can either click the add button at the top or the plus sign next to receive payments to just cut down on the amount of changing screens that we'd have to do. And when we come here, we start off blank because we haven't started inside of an invoice. And so if I'm processing this because I want it to be an undeposited fund, I select undeposited funds, use our undeposited funds account number, choose our customer. We can see here it's telling us the customer does have a balance, so we're going to be able to find an invoice. If we know our payment we're receiving, we can have that applied or ready to apply. Our check number, our memo, but we don't have an invoice here for us to apply the payment against. We actually have to go look for the invoices. And so here's a list of all the open invoices for that customer. If there were multiple ones, we can select all the invoices that we need to. In this case, there's one, so we can just hit the checkbox next to it, add that, and then close the screen. So now we're back here. It's automatically applied the payment for us. And now we could post this payment. So we're going to post this as if it was a $2 check received instead of $1. On the line, we can see amount available to pay is $1. Amount overpaid is $1. And that's the funding source I've used for the draw. Before this, we could not apply an overpayment. So this is allowing us to cut down on a lot of steps that we've had to do and some other accounting issues that we would face. So now we can post this. And now when we bring back up the customer, the balance is -1. If we go to find invoices, there won't be any because the person is paid off. And if we look at one of the reports, we can go to a general ledger report. And we'll do it for today with our program, our checkbook, and our funding source. And our customer. We'll see a lot of different things that have happened. We see the posting for our federal grant. Here's that draw. So the drawdown creates a credit that sits out there. It also creates a receivable. And then when I made the overpayment, we had $2 that went to undeposited funds, $1 that went to receivables, and a $1 balance that sits in AR overpayments. So anytime we needed to look for our customers who had overpayments, we'd be able to look either at our general ledger report, a trial balance, dimension balances, any of those to see where do our overpayments sit. Not something we really need to worry probably too much about when it comes to grants, but for everybody else, like solid waste receives a lot of payments either greater than their invoices, and this is an easier way of managing those balances so that they know those people have these large credits and it sits in an account different than accounts receivable, since it goes to AR overpayments. And from here, we can wait until a new bill is created and apply that credit. Or if that was just a mistake from the person or the program or whoever had made that payment, we can then work on getting this paid back out to the customer so we can zero out the balance. So whichever is the most convenient. And as of right now, I think childcare is the only program so far that's used this overpayment amount. And and they're currently sitting on the balance waiting for that to apply to a future invoice for one of the parents that use childcare. And so I received the payment. I didn't apply the payment as a deposit yet. So if we're working in, like TED Loans, for example, uses this, we're receiving payments just as I did, as an undeposited fund. If we're not sure about whether or not we've created deposits, in accounts receivable, we have a report under registers and receipts. In other words, payments we've received. And so if I use the current month, with my checkbook and program, we have options to show details or only include undeposited funds. So if I didn't use those yet and I viewed this receipts register, we get that basic information. Here's the date that the receipt was created for. Here's the customer. We use check payment method. There's that check number. Transaction day again. A $2 amount was received. $1 was applied, but it was not deposited. So if we work in a program that has any records of undeposited funds, what we're telling Intacct is none of this money has gone to the bank. And so if we're trying to reconcile a bank account, our records might not match, especially if it did go to the bank, but we didn't include that. And more importantly, if we were trying to do purchasing transactions and didn't include these deposits, that means our cash didn't increase. So if Lynette is out there looking at your non-PO vouchers or other payment requests, and we didn't create deposits, that's leaving your cash amount short and may result in purchases getting declined. So this would tell us, hey, we have work to do. We haven't made a deposit. This also gives us the option to look at the invoice that we applied the payment to. So if we weren't sure where check number 123456789 was posted to, we don't have to guess. We can come to this report, find that check number, and the link to invoices to see where does that payment originate to. And so then we would have that drawdown information and say, okay, well, that's the amount we've paid. Was that the correct invoice? Was it supposed to be for a different one? If it was a drawdown, on occasion we have an amount that comes in that gets applied to the wrong invoice. Easiest way to find those payments. We can add details to the report. So if I click show details, it adds the general ledger account that was used. And really that's about the only other additional thing other than general ledger account and memo. So we get a little more detailed information about what it is. And now we have a link to the invoice rather than having to go through invoices. Or if we only wanted funds that were not deposited. And this one only has the one transaction, so it was going to show up on either report. This would give us a list of undeposited funds. So if I'm working in TED or solid waste, I would be running this report when this is over to take a look at what's sitting in your undeposited funds account. And then hopefully we've been working on or using the dimension balances report. So we have this as a tool, which helps us look up payments. But if we didn't want specific information, we were just looking for balances, dimension balances will get us there too. So if we go to general ledger, dimension balances, we can build a report to display the information we'd want to see. We tell it which period of time, We don't want to use one of these reporting periods. We can override this by choosing our own opening and closing dates. So we'll just leave it for current month since I have the one transaction. We can pick a specific account number or account range. If the numbers we have don't fit inside of a range, we can select multiple accounts. So if we wanted to look at accounts receivable, if we wanted to make sure we included AR advances, AR overpayments, and revenue, we can do just that without having to suffer through having all these extra accounts, especially for our actual active funding sources. It's likely we're going to have balances that fit in between these numbers, like fund balance. We might have due to, due froms, and we don't want that included. We only want these specific things. Then we can pick and choose the accounts we want to see. And that's with any general ledger report with the exception of trial balance. So I've got the accounts I want to see selected, and we do the same thing. What is our program? What is our checkbook? Funding source isn't required. Any funding source that fits with this combination of program and checkbook would return a result if we left funding source blank. And if we don't want that to happen, we need to pick an actual funding source. And if we're only wanting to look at parent information and not include any of the sub funds, yeah, if you haven't done that before, you can uncheck include subs. So if you just want to see the parent, check that so you don't have to get all the other stuff. Select a customer, or we can choose the one customer. And then here we can format how we want the report to be shown. If I run it as it is now, I just have funding source ID selected. We're going to get a $2 balance, but we have no idea who that balance is for. If it's for a customer, we have no idea what the balances are in those account numbers we picked. So while we know that that customer has a $2 credit somewhere, which account is that credit in? Is this a revenue account? One of the receivables, that kind of stuff? We don't know. So we can add more information to this. So we'll add our customer ID and name, and the account ID and name. And now we can see where the actual balances sit rather than having to guess who it was for or what account numbers it sat in. And the accounts that don't have a balance aren't included right now in this report. It's just the ones that still have a balance in the period of time we're running. So now I would know that we have the dollar revenue, which is great. That's from that invoice, but we also have the dollar overpayment. And so if we had more customers than this, we can get a quick list of who's all overpaid that we might owe, and something we need to be mindful of for future invoices. So for the programs that receive undeposited funds, that hasn't changed. The accounts receivable portion has, about how we're going to apply payments using received payments new. We need to start making this a practice for receiving our payments, whether it's for our invoices or even for our drawdowns, since we know if I'm going to pay a drawdown directly by going to order entry, we're going to miss out on a credit memo. And if we miss on a credit memo, that leaves the invoice out there unpaid for a long period of time. And so we'd want to make sure we take care of that. On the general ledger, it looks fine, but in accounts receivable, it isn't. So we need to start making this a practice. But when we receive payments as undeposited funds, As a program user, we have to then go and create our own deposit to make sure we use the date for the bank. So I'm going to switch to checkbook 35 in Intacct so I can cut out all the other activity that's happening. And I'm going to add a new deposit for checkbook 35. We choose our account, we hit continue, and we would get a list of funds that aren't deposited. So whether we're in the TED program, solid waste, childcare, we process a payment, we can come to this list, we'll see a list of payments we've received as undeposited funds waiting for us to deposit. The deposit defaults to the day we're working on. So if I had received this payment last month and I'm creating it now, this is how it's going to go. It's going to default to today. So we would want to make sure that we change the date to match the actual record of when the payment went to the bank to make Lori's job easier for bank reconciliation so she doesn't have to pick and choose what date the deposit might have been. And what this also does, the reason we use undeposited funds, is when you're receiving multiple payments in the day, when we receive it as an undeposited fund and then deposit this, it goes in as one single entry into our books. So if we had multiple payments, we get $1 amount that has to be matched to our bank records because our bank would just have the one deposit. And it's easier to balance our bank account that way rather than if we had, like solid waste might have dozens of payments in a single day. So if they were receiving the payments one by one and posting them like we do in finance, we'd have to figure out which one of these 40 deposits might have made up today's deposit to the bank, or which ones of those 40 went actually the next day. So we use the date. It gives a generic name, ID slip, deposit slip 4221. We can add more descriptions if it was necessary for information purposes. We can add an attachment. A lot of us already do this attachment, like if you're in the insurance department. Usually we're entering these, creating the deposit after it's been made to the bank. Or TALP, TED, we're getting a confirmation that the stuff's at the bank already. So you can attach that document if you wanted to for more detailed records in the future, so it's all accessible in one place rather than hoping that your files were in order. And then we can make the one deposit that we have, which is that $2 check. And now if we went to our undeposited funds report, this account will have no undeposited funds. Going to our accounts receivable receipts registers. I only want to see undeposited funds, so that's checked. It remembers that from the last time. And there'd be nothing there, which is what we'd want to see once we think we've prepared our deposits. If I uncheck undeposited funds only, payment comes back and we can see the deposited on 4/2. So even in the event we're looking for a payment that's already been deposited, we would have that record here. If for some reason we receive a payment that doesn't have a corresponding invoice, we need to have it applied because we need the record to show that the payment's been received. And there's no invoice. There's no way for us to apply it. So we can't use accounts receivable, receive a payment, nothing would show up. We can't go to order entry and find a drawdown or another type of order entry transaction that doesn't exist. And if we want to make sure we get that record in, so we see this happen against solid waste quite a lot. People will have a payment or a payroll deduction before an invoice exists. They can actually go to accounts receivable and click the plus sign for advances and start building a summary for an advance that they've received before the invoice was applied or before the invoice was created. So this allows them to store that payment, deposit that payment, and then wait for the activity to occur. But what that also means is Intacct doesn't tell us later, hey, here's a reminder, you have a person out here with a credit balance and you need to apply that invoice. So that responsibility becomes ours to figure out as we're looking through this stuff. And we see that in like drawdown. If we have a drawdown sitting out there, and monitor has gotten this far and realizes, you know what, we've canceled the request, we're not going to have money drawn down or whatever reason. So we went ahead and created a credit memo. The status of this still says open and still wants us to pay it. So if I go inside of this, still has an amount due. We can enter our amount, our reference number, and whatever we think we're doing to make a payment to a drawdown that we tried to cancel. The same thing applies for our payment advances. If we're using this method to receive a payment, we're missing out on more information about the invoice. So if we go back to accounts receivable to receive this rather than through order entry, whether you use the old one, let's use the old method. Now we can fully see, here's that credit memo waiting to be applied against that invoice. This customer has $1 credit that can be applied against the invoice. And if we use that other method, we're going to miss that and still leave these things hanging out there. And more importantly, these things will always sit out there on our aging reports as something that's due, something that's unresolved. And then eventually one of us will get an email from Janet saying, what's wrong with this? Someone needs to fix this. And we can't do journal entries to fix this. You can do as many journal entries as you want. When this action occurs inside of order entry or accounts receivable, it has to be fixed inside of those programs. That'd be like having an open purchase order and thinking you can do a journal entry to close it. It doesn't do that. It might fix a balance, but it leaves this still sitting out there. So if we see these types of balances there, we know that's our direction, that it has to be fixed through accounts receivable or order entry. And I created a scenario like for the credit memos. Becky probably just got an email like I did that says a credit memo for $1 was created, go take care of it. So that hopefully will help on managing this stuff. But if we're in a program like solid waste who posts payroll or post payment advances, so that would sit here as an available overpayment in advance, and they're not applying those, they just sit there waiting for them to take action. And if they're paying it through order entry, going to their invoices, and then finding whoever owes a bill, like this lady here, If there's a credit sitting out there, this place isn't going to tell us. It's just going to tell us there's a bill due. And so we end up with scenarios where some programs have $93,000 in unapplied payments. Looks fine on our general ledger report, but when we run an aging report on accounts receivable, we can see payments haven't been applied or taken care of for months, in some cases years. Which leads us to the next report we can use. I need to get a drawdown so we can look at this report. So we're going to use this education customer, 1520, or checkbook 96 for education. If I run an aging report, it's going to show me any invoice or drawdown, any order entry activity basically, that's 1 to 30 days past due, 31 to 60, 61 to 90, or 91 days and over. So we use the checkbook and program for whoever we're doing this for, or if you're the user, you're going to have solid waste checkbook 90. You can specify a customer if you want to just bring one person up. TUC uses this, and right now I think we probably have like 15 different invoicing activity happening in Intacct now. So we have that all in there. I view this report. It's going to tell us that there's a drawdown that hasn't been paid for 30 days. So either the funding agency doesn't give us payments timely manner, a payment has been applied somewhere else in error, or there's another circumstance here that tells us this drawdown needs to be corrected. If we went out and did a journal entry to say, that's no longer outstanding, let's do a journal entry to clear accounts receivable, this will still sit there past due, and tomorrow this thing's going to slide over to the next column and sit there. So what is it we're going to do with this drawdown? And for any program that has accounts receivables, this would be a frequent report we'd want to check to see what's happening to our invoices out there we've created. And for drawdowns and grants, likelihood is we probably shouldn't have anyone on the verge of coming over to the 31 to 60 days past due column. Sorry about that, Tracy. There's another one out there that's like that too, but that was the first one I saw. And so Danny, you could look at this for TED loans. Not TELP, since we're not using this system for TELP, but for TED, you could come here, bring up a report, and get an easy report to see how long it's been since one of those loans have been paid off. And it doesn't matter, like in this case, this drawdown was actually more than this. It's just going off that the full amount was due on March 30th. So whether it's a partial payment that's been had or there's no payments at all, we're going to see how long it's been since the due date and how late that thing could be. So if we're in finances, accounts receivable, solid waste, child care, adult corrections, alcohol treatment, IT, TUC, this report would tell us a lot of valuable information about what we're doing. The same thing would go for like credits that aren't applied. If we have balances, like the credit memo, we would see a credit that just sits out there unapplied for however long it would take for that to be resolved. The one I created today wouldn't show on this report since it's looking for stuff one day past that. But starting tomorrow, if I didn't go back through and reverse all this stuff I've done, we're going to start to see this credit memo is going to start to show in an aging report as a balance that needs to be addressed. Does anyone have questions in the chat box? If you have anything about receiving these payments or these reports. So now, if we've made a mistake, I had a typo that wasn't supposed to be $2 that was deposited, how do I fix that amount? Can we still use the old way Yes, you can. It's going to go away. Any improvements Intacct makes will no longer be to this method. And of course, if you use order entry for making your payments, you're going to miss out on being able to apply any credit memos or credit adjustments that have been made to offset these balances. So you're welcome to continue using the old way, but if you do, you're putting yourself in a bad position for when that time comes and they take it away. Or we're putting ourselves in a bad way, like in this case where I created a credit memo. There's no way for me to apply a credit memo right here. And it looks like I still owe that person. So those are things we just need to make ourselves aware with, that if we want to use this way, a good chance of missing out on valuable information. Or we use this way and we don't try it, try the new way. When the new time comes, our work might stop when we're trying to figure out how to use this again. But yes, it's still available to use. If I have to fix this $2 deposit, first thing I have to do is reverse the deposit I've created. So here's my $2 deposit. It's dated for 4/2. If I can reverse this to today, we would give a reason. Made an error, check entry error, data error, posted to the wrong day, posted to the wrong customer, whatever it is. If we've deposited the payment, this is where we're starting. We're reversing the deposit. And that means if we had multiple payments inside of this deposit, all of them will go to undeposited funds, not just the one we're looking for, because this is the whole deposit overall. So now I've got that out of there. We can see I don't have the reverse option anymore. It actually says that payment's reversed. Here's the reversal. If we go to create a deposit for checkbook 35, that payment's sitting back out there. So if I had made an error on the date, now I can fix that date. You know what, that was actually March 31st. Now I can deposit it and save. We'd be okay there. If the payment was made entirely in error, now we can go to where I received the payment. Get rid of all the other people. So we have this $2 payment. Let's get rid of the other ones. Our $2 payment, it's still undeposited now because we reversed it. If we don't want that payment to exist anymore, what do we do with it? We can enter our memo to explain, incorrect payment, whatever the reason would be. Maybe we had entered it once before, so it's a duplicate, which we see occasionally. Whatever the reason would be, we have a good reason to reverse it, we're going to reverse it. Got today's date. That's the same date as the transaction. Now that payment's reversed. So if I go to draw, where I created that, we now have 2 unpaid invoices because I've taken that payment out. So if we still expect to collect a payment on this, we're good to go. Now we wait for the new payment. Sorry, I applied the wrong payment to the wrong invoice or whatever the reason is, but now it's still sitting there unpaid, waiting for the next step. And so whether it's a drawdown, someone's garbage bill, someone's childcare bill. We've slid all of that out and we've put that back to being due. We no longer have an overpayment, an undeposited fund. We no longer have a deposit or cash entry at all. Now we're back to just having a receivables entry and a revenue entry, waiting for the next step. If the person wasn't going to make this payment, or we've determined this invoice is no longer valid, we have payment activity against it. So if I went to delete this, will it allow me to delete it? Nope, it's already been paid, can't be deleted. Even though we reverse the payment, it still has that record. We can't hide any sort of activity when it concerns cash. So if we're a program, they can go to accounts receivable and issue an adjustment for credit. We're going to have a $2 adjustment or a $1 adjustment against that bill. We want that to be applied because we want to cancel out the bill. I need it off the books. I still don't want it to sit there unpaid till the end of time or until Janet questions why there's a balance sitting there for that long in another year, right? So we can create an invoice or an invoice adjustment, basically a credit adjustment, and then have that applied against the invoice. If it's a drawdown, built into drawdown, nowhere else, IT, alcohol treatment, travel, anybody else, we don't have this access. Only for drawdowns. If we've decided that we're done with this, we can convert a credit memo. We're not going to receive cash. We just want this off the books. We want that receivable gone. Now we can apply our credit memo. Becky and I just got this email saying credit memo, whatever has been created, please log into accounts receivable, receive it. It was created from this drawdown. And there's another one that just come in for it. So at least we've got the latest information that it's sitting there. But just like that other one, it's sitting open, ready to pay. So if we want to use, I don't know if the old way is referring to this, we're going to miss out on that credit memo activity. But if we do go to accounts receivable, whether it's the old way here's those two credit memos. Here's those two draws. So we could apply those to those drawdowns to get them off the books so they're no longer in an aging report. As I've said before, journal entry isn't going to fix this. If we go to the new way, you can pick our customer, our checkbook, we'll add our two invoices and we'll close the screen. We can see credits available $2. And we'd have to enter the credit to apply. And just simply just click in the field, type a buck, credits available now changes to nothing. There's no credit available anymore for this customer. The outstanding amount changes to $0 because of that. If we didn't know where the credits were from, we could click on the blue hyperlink and it would tell us, here's your credit memos. But now we have those applied. We can click post anew or just post. And now when we go back to draw, our test customer is gone off the books. That amount's closed. We reverse the deposit, so we no longer have cash sitting in an account that doesn't actually have cash. And all of our balances are back to zero. So we would no longer have questions for audit about why this balance had been sitting there for so long. Okay, do we have any other questions? If not, thank you everybody for your time. Enjoy the rest of your day.